And good evening. Good evening. It's 7 p.m. and we're going to talk a little bit about ethics. Three moral theories and one major problem that they might have. Let's bring up. So yes, tonight's lecture is about ethics. And let's see if I can grab a pointer. It's not my necessarily favourite subject. I don't actually do an awful lot of moral philosophy. It's something I found to be very, very interesting for a while. Really kind of like fascinating. I mean, one of my favourite books when I was learning philosophy was a book called After Virtue by a philosopher called Alistair McIntyre. And it's possibly one of the introductions or one of the first texts, I suppose, that really sort of brings to the fore what's called virtue ethics. And that's going to be one of the things we look at tonight. And I used to have a lot of interest in moral theory. I used to read a woman called Agnes Heller, who was a kind of Marxist ethicist and all sorts of stuff, as well as the usual kind of philosophical fare. After a while, I kind of got bored of ethics and morality, and I will talk a bit about that maybe tonight, about what's interesting and what can be frustrating, or what you can find difficult about philosophy when it comes to moral theories. But first of all, we're going to sort of just do some very basic stuff. So there's a couple of things I want to introduce tonight as well, but I think I'm going to kind of start with just going through, as it were, the three kind of basic moral theories we have. And those three moral theories are utilitarianism, deontology, it's a strange one, and virtue ethics. So utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And these three theories kind of they're all current, I would say, inside moral philosophy. There's possibly more virtue ethics that I come across, but that's possibly because I'm interested more. If I do read moral philosophy, I'm interested more in reading virtue ethics. But they're all still current theories. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about things like utilitarianism and the development of utilitarianism as a philosophical theory is that in their development, they kind of show, in some sense, a positive side of philosophy, a side in which, things get kind of thrashed out a little bit, and there is actually some sort of development. Anyway, let's go through the three and their kind of basic problems, and then we can look at the field in a little bit more breadth, perhaps. That's the sort of general plan of tonight. So don't worry too much about some of the details I'm going to give you, because obviously, as you remember, this is an introduction to philosophy class, so we can't get into the depths. What we're going to try and do is give you some stuff to orientate yourself. For the Free University of Brighton people, it's obviously better if you do some of the reading that's on the River pages. We have a forum there with our reading, so if you do some of the reading that associates with the lectures, that really works quite nicely. And as I've spoken to in some of the seminars already, some people are doing the reading after the lectures, which works perfectly well as well. Anyway, so let's have a look. As I said, there's three major moral theories: utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And we're going to look at those three. And so your first kind of task when you're thinking about moral theory in terms of philosophy is just to get familiar with the terrain, because when you encounter a problem, one of the things that's going to when you encounter a kind of moral question in philosophy, one of the things that's going to be kind of assumed is that, well, there's these various possible options that you could take in kind of responding to that problem. And so if you don't know the options, then you're going to have difficulties trying to at least follow the very sort of first basic steps. You may disagree with those options, but it's necessary in a sense to sort of know that they are there. That's part of what we do when we try and introduce you to the terrain, to what kind of things other people know exist in that area. So utilitarianism. Apologies, I have a little bit of cough. Utilitarianism. Utility. A moral theory based on the utility of the act. most famous, made by Spock in Star Trek, I imagine. Benefit of the greater good and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things we class utilitarianism as is we call it a consequentialist theory. It's called a consequentialist theory, a form of consequentialism, because utilitarianism is part of a kind of a broader approach, if you like, in which the moral value of an act lies in its consequences. And so utilitarianism is a version of that. So consequentialism would just mean something like, yes, as I say, the moral value of an act lies in the consequences. But utilitarianism gives us a way of trying to work out how to assess those consequences. And it uses sometimes what's called a calculus. So it has this kind of impression, or it gives this impression of being a very kind of rationalistic way of dealing with moral problems. And that's, in some sense, one of its advantages. But when I talk about a calculus, what I mean is a kind of set of criteria that you can almost assign numbers to. You can almost assign weights and values to them. And then you can kind of judge, like, or on scales, is there a greater value here, or is there a greater value there? And for utilitarianism, the motto, basic rule of thumb, general maxim, the axiom, if you like, the kind of starting point from which arguments might then be built, and the agreed point of view that you're going to take if you're going to use utilitarianism is this slogan: the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Seems obvious, it seems nice and intuitive, it seems like it's common sense. It's not quite as obvious as it might first appear. Words like happiness can be rather slippery, and the greatest happiness, God, even more slippery now. So now we're beginning to sort of perhaps edge back a little bit, but on first impressions, it seems pretty clear, pretty straightforward, pretty rationalistic. It's a theory formulated by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, most famously, but it's continued, as I say, as a live option inside philosophical ethics. And one of the most famous proponents probably is a guy called Peter Singer, and Peter does a lot of work on animal rights, animal liberation questions, the role of the animal in relationship to the human. Originally, this is with Bentham primarily, but I suppose a little bit with Mill, but primarily with Bentham, utilitarianism begins as a kind of what's called a hedonism, a hedonic theory, in which the greatest happiness, that kind of pleasure, happiness merging together. And obviously, there's a kind there are certain things that we enjoy but are not good for us, let's say. And so there's a kind of complexity around talking about the greatest happiness. There are certain things that, we know might become self-destructive, for example, but give us an enormous amount of pleasure at the time. And so those kind of things become slightly more complicated. But originally it began as a kind of hedonic theory, a theory based on like pleasure and happiness. In the 20th century, it began to change a little bit. It began to be a bit more, I suppose, tidied up, or trying to be systematized, trying to be made into a kind of working theory. There was quite a lot of work done on it. And it was formulated. There were two different kind of versions of utilitarianism that were formulated: a kind of limited and a version and an expansive version, often called one's called act utilitarianism, and the other is called rule utilitarianism. And the problem, I suppose, is when we talk about judging a moral act, at what level do we judge the act, and using what kinds of means? So I mean, at the sort of finest level, every single possible action would be considered, in almost infinite depth. And of course, what would happen is we'd never bloody do anything. We'd never be able to get anywhere. And so we tend to think of like moral questions not being there all the time. They arise at certain points. they arise with certain acts and not others, but even then, thinking about each of those acts, like it's from like a starting point and considering all the details of a particular act, this could be seen to be, in a sense, impractical. It could seem to be kind of, problematic. I mean, there's issues of consistency between one act and another, all sorts of things. So act utilitarianism kind of focuses on the idea that, you make the moral judgment at the level of the act, and then encounters these problems about where the act is. And rule utilitarianism kind of says, well, we come to kind of general rules, and we have general rules as to sort of the kind of moral worth of behaviours, and then there are exceptions, and so we always kind of take account of those exceptions, and we can still do a utilitarian calculus on the exception. But there's a kind of general rule of thumb, when walking by someone in the street, you don't smack them in the face for no apparent reason. That's a kind of general rule of thumb, is that we are, not aggressive towards each other generally, or not impolite, or, there's a whole kind of series of general rules we might also say. And so rule utilitarianism kind of thinks it works a little bit more like that. There's some kind of generalizations we can make, some of which can also be codified into law and things like that. This is just, if you want to check out, I think the Wikipedias are great on these, actually. Utilitarianism, Deontology and Virtue Ethics, the entries on in Wikipedia, they seem perfectly reasonable. So obviously they're not sources, but they are good starting points sometimes, if they're not completely corrupted or all over the place or gone weird, and they don't seem to have gone weird, those particular entries. So this is from the Wikipedia entry on utilitarianism, so you can go and check this out if you want, and it just makes the distinction that act utilitarianism maintains that an action is right if it maximizes utility. Rule utilitarianism maintains an action is right if it conforms to a rule that maximizes utility. So you can see there's just a kind of there's a kind of difference in the sort of object of analysis, the object of calculus. Difficult problems. All I'm going to do tonight is just run through these three theories and talk about some of the elements of the theories, and then talk about some of the sort of fairly standard problems that are often addressed with them. So that's just the first sort of section of what we're doing tonight. So let's do problems for utilitarianism. Well, generally speaking, it's thought to be pretty difficult to get a lot of agreement. So you'd think it was easy and obvious, but in fact, there's an enormous range of disputes. There's not an awful lot of settled agreement, we might say. I mean, this is a really judgmental kind of thing to say, because obviously I'm sort of giving I have an implicit criteria of what would be settled agreements and things kicking on in the background. So this may just be fairly normal amongst philosophers, of course, not to come to any particular agreement. But if we've got a moral theory and it's meant to be helping us with our actions and behaviours, then you'd have thought, the basics should be kind of be able to be agreed upon, maybe. It doesn't seem to be the case. The quantity of happiness versus the quality of happiness. Does it really matter? Well, obviously, you can kind of, I imagine, immediately pop into your head, the fact that you can kind of see that that's going to be a dispute. How much happiness as opposed to the kind of, the kind of happiness it is. Yes, I mean, if you're a slave and you're still living in luxury and all, sort of supposedly good conditions, so in effect all of your happiness is dependent upon someone else and your life as well. Would that really matter? Obviously it does seem like it does. It does seem like there's a quality issue in moral behaviours. And so it's not clear how we're going to judge between quantities of happiness and qualities of happiness. There's various kinds of problems here, things like maximization. Is it better to have a large unhappy population or a small happy one? Less quantity, more quality, maybe. Are we better to be happy pigs or sad humans? This is one of the phrases that's often used. Is it better to be a happy pig or a sad human? A lot of people will quite happily go happy pig in that situation, but obviously the intuition supposedly is that we want to go sad human rather than happy pig. So that kind of issue around quality kind of kicks in there quite heavily. There's also what we might call epistemological problems. These occur with a lot of moral theories, actually, and they can become places where moral theory gets quite complicated because it kind of merges with a kind of epistemological issues. Remember, last couple of weeks we've been looking at epistemology, so the Descartes and the Hume. That was a little bit of epistemology. Epistemology is the science of knowledge. The sort of study of knowledge, and his question often is, how do you know that? What are your means of making that knowledge claim? And so the same kind of thing would apply to, in a sense, to moral claims. How do you know that? What's the kind of evidence that you're going to give for this? What's the reasoning you're going to give for this? So there are epistemological issues that arise, in particular around things like, we can sort of say things like irrational preferences versus rational preferences, sort of temporal blindness. It's very difficult to know what's going to happen as a consequence of an act. So there's issues around how utilitarianism can kind of know the things that it needs to calculate. And also there is a kind of there's a sort of more subtle issues around that sort of slogan, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. I mean, it's aiming at a goal. And is that goal maximising pleasure or minimising suffering? Because you might do different things if your goal was to maximise pleasure than you would if you were minimising suffering. Just 2 seconds here. Just going to give a link to a student. 1 second. Right. So there are issues with problems for utilitarianism, and there are advantages. I think. Before we rush ahead, I think the kind of character of utilitarianism is itself quite interesting. When we look at Nietzsche next week, and we're not looking at Nietzsche really in terms of ethics, really, even though the text is kind of references morality. But one of the things we do when we look at Nietzsche is we look at a text called on the Genealogy of Morals. Which is a famous text by Nietzsche that puts forward the master-slave revolt and all these kind of interesting inversions and stuff that might occur in our language between the words good and bad and good and evil. He thinks the sort of good and evil is a kind of inversion and a kind of a restructuring of an original sort of good and bad distinction that didn't have the same kind of value judgments as good and evil does. And he talks in the Genealogy of Morals about the English utilitarians, and this kind of atmosphere or character that utilitarian often comes across as having, which is that it knows best, that it has at least a method of knowing best. And I think that's not a terrible thing necessarily. Obviously, there are some issues with that. They're not always the people you want to spend the night at the pub with, the people who know best. But at the same time, when it does come to moral questions, one of the things that utilitarianism offers people is a way of getting out of the rut of not knowing what to do or not knowing what's right or wrong. If you don't know what's right or wrong, utilitarianism gives you some means by which you can begin to at least organise your thoughts and maybe get something that's satisfactory to you, and a way of doing that, and a way of sort of understanding what you've done. So in some sense, I think that's quite useful, and it can be quite it can be quite a counter to a kind of moral cynicism where you can kind of just give up on the question of morality. So utilitarianism, despite its problems, all of which are kind of useful thinking process problems, they're ways of trying to make our understanding more complex. They're not necessarily problems that destroy utilitarianism. They're problems that utilitarianism provokes you to talk about and think about. But all the problems with utilitarianism doesn't necessarily sort of decry from the fact, as I say, that it can be a useful kind of calculus if you want to get out of a kind of moral cynicism. Now let's talk about deontology. There we go. I'm just going to put that up full screen just for a moment so you can see it. Right, and as you can see there, this strange word, deontology. So if utilitarianism is perhaps most famously associated with John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, deontology is perhaps most famously associated with Immanuel Kant. And deontic, this is the root of deontology, deontic. So let's just so you got the language and you've got that strange bit of jargon there. Let's take you back. I mean, utilitarianism is a kind of strange bit of jargon, but at least it's got the root utility, so you can kind of get a hook onto it. You know, it's to do with utility. That's what that moral theory is about. Deontology doesn't have that hook, but it's about the deontic, and the deontic is a kind of basically means duty. So it's a duty-based moral theory. Deontic is duty. Remember it with the D. Deontic, duty. So it's a duty-based or a duty-centered moral theory. And as I say, it's primarily sort of thought to be associated with Immanuel Kant. And it focuses really heavily on whether the act is right, not on its consequences. So consequentialism and deontology are the two really broad categories. So you can focus on the consequences of an act, or you can focus on the act itself. And so deontology focuses on whether the act is right rather than those consequences. Is it deontic in that it has to do with the logic of the duties or obligations we have? The obligations are the things, you know, obeying the rules, duties, you know, what's the right thing to do. Immanuel Kant's perhaps the most famous proponent of the deontological ethics. It doesn't get called this till the 1930s. It's not something it's not a term Kant uses. And Kant is most famous for a thing called the Categorical Imperative. So like utilitarianism in its slogan, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, deontology, or Kant in particular as a version of deontology, he also has a slogan, except he's got three, and they have different kind of like forms. And there's some really interesting stuff in his book. There's a short little book he writes on moral philosophy. There's a huge treatise called The Critique of Practical Reason, which is the second of three big critiques he writes. So he writes a critique of pure reason, which is what makes Kant, like, you know, the big shift moment in philosophy. Then he writes a critique of practical reason. Then he writes a critique of judgment. But he also writes these little pamphlets, these little introductions to his work, because the critiques are big and, you know, detailed and systematic and take you a long time to work your way through. But he wrote these little pamphlets because he kind of wanted to popularise his work to a degree as well. And so in both the Critique of Practical Reason and in these little pamphlets, you find this thing called the Categorical Imperative, which is the way in which we judge an act rather than its consequences. We judge it using the Categorical Imperative. And as I say, there are three forms in which these take place. I'm going to go through them, but I'm probably not going to talk about them at all because you could spend a long time going through these. So the first, you should act only according to that rule or maxim by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. So any rule you use, you have to kind of think of it as a universal rule, a universal law. You should act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. This is a kind of another side of that universal rule, but it also is to do with the way in which you can't convert individuals into consequences either. They have to be kind of dealt with, you know, in themselves, let's say. And the third version is every rational being must so act as if he were, through his maxim, always a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. So you have to take responsibility for the universal in your act, and there's quite a kind of almost parliamentary or legalistic or judicial structure to this setup that Kant gives. But the general idea is you know, you're going to need to behave in such a way that it's not your subjective rule. It's not your good. It's not your particular values. There's going to be this kind of community of values that you are part of and that the rules are kind of organising, and you need to deal with it in that kind of way. So again, like utilitarianism, it has quite a strong rationalist capacity because it pushes us to think of moral action, moral behaviour in terms of those universals, in terms of those community rules. Its difficulties, obviously, are also going to be worth noting. So let's quickly scoot along to its difficulties. So yes, what is the source of the rules? That's going to be like one of your biggest issues. God, maybe, reason. Generally speaking, not the individual, or generally speaking, not society. That can be a bit more complicated, but the rules are going to have a kind of objectivity. And the question arises as to why you should submit to that authority, why you should, as an individual, submit yourself to this collective. And then there's the issue of how do you apply the rules, because, for example, if lying is to be avoided, what about situations in which telling the truth causes harm? This is a famous kind of example you'll find in a lot of introduction to philosophy lectures. So you'd end up with this kind of strange situation in which the act of lying is morally negative. It's not to be done because you can't universalize that. Everyone lying, trust collapses, there's a whole kind of failure of society, the collective is damaged, etc., etc. So lying is a kind of positive thing that you want to essentially say is generally the way things should be done, except with deontology it's a kind of rule you have to kind of universalize, so it's always the way you have to do things, and then of course an escaped someone escaping an axe murderer takes refuge in your house, and the axe murderer knocks on the door and asks if they're there, and you can't lie, so you have to let them in, and then your inability to lie has by omission caused some other horrific act to occur. Now, obviously, these are kind of a bit of a joke situations, and most of us. But what they aim to do is when we think of what that's called a thought experiment. When we think of these kind of thought experiments, these joke situations, sometimes, or these slightly ludicrous situations. They're slightly ludicrous in a sense because what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring different elements of a theory or of a philosophical theory into conflict, to see if there are inconsistencies, to see what the limits are of a particular element of a philosophical theory. So there, obviously, we're just trying to sort of show that the difficulties in the idea of a universal rule. There's also, this is a really interesting question, not one we can explore really, but it's one that I would encourage people to sort of think about it, because so deontology relies on some sense of knowledge of the duty that you're meant to be kind of carrying out. There's a duty at the heart of deontology to obey the moral law in the first place. There's a kind of duty to be morally legislative and morally capable, and there's a kind of way in which that is articulated as being known to us through an inner sense. It's as though this is not what Kant says, but it is as though there's a kind of articulation of a kind of internal moral good, an internal moral compass, as some people might call it, that is there. And sometimes that's explicitly discussed, in which case you can find some really interesting conversations around that. But most of the time it's kind of implicitly unacknowledged, that there's this kind of strange premise that people want to do good. And there's also another kind of crucial issue, which is that deontological moral theory relies on something we might call intentions. So if you do the right thing for the wrong reason, it doesn't count. So if you kind of accidentally are morally good, it doesn't count. But who on earth would be able to tell? And then this isn't sort of simply manipulation. This isn't simply, a kind of a situation in which someone appears to do the right thing, but in fact they're manipulating some situation to get something else out of it. It is more like, if if you come up with another kind of answer using a different set of reasons, maybe you're a utilitarian, and you come up with the same answer as someone with based around deontology and duty, they're still wrong. They're still not morally good, because they're not using this kind of moral framework of the universal, the society, the collective, and all these kind of things. And so their intention was in a sense mistaken. So that it's not necessarily that they're bad, but they're not morally valuable. They still have a lot to learn about what would be morally valuable. So there are some really quite strange elements to deontology as well. I suppose I always, and this again is characterise it a little bit, but I kind of always think of it as a little bit like a church ethics. There's a kind of slight purity to it. But that reliance on inner sense, I think, offers it some strength sometimes when people want to talk about moral character, moral compasses, a kind of moral intuition, because it articulates it in some sense a little bit better than utilitarianism, perhaps. So utilitarianism often has issues when we start talking about the quality of happiness, because it starts to have issues when it encounters kind of something we might think of as our intuition or our common sense not being quite comfortable with some of the answers. And there's a really interesting experiment that's used around that. Whereas deontology has this kind of advantage that it has this idea that there's a moral worth at the heart of things, and that you're trying to then articulate these rules that would enable this moral sense, this inner sense of morality or duty, to be kind of clearly expressed. So there's some sense in which it might work for some people, but a bit churchy for me. Virtue ethics. So I'm going to deal with virtue ethics in about 5 minutes. We're just going to take a little break. So go and have a stretch, go and, have a drink of water, use the loo, but just basically move around a little bit, and I'll be back in 5 minutes. I'll see you then. Right. We'll start again in a moment. Okay. We'll start again. Hopefully you've had a bit of a stretch, and as I say, it's always good to do the reading alongside these lectures. Afterwards is also good, and obviously if you're watching these at some other point in time, then you can check in the Discord if you need to find bits and pieces to read or have any questions. Let's carry on with virtue ethics. This is the third of our moral theories. Remember, we've got utilitarianism, we've got deontology, and now we've got virtue ethics. So utilitarianism, utility, calculus, maximize happiness, deontology, duty, universality, inner sense of what's good, and the need to obey a moral law, virtue ethics, character. That's the word to kind of remember. Character and practice. Virtue ethics is how do you make yourself a better person? So it originates in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is a text actually. I mean that you would have been taught in moral philosophy for a long time. So in a sense, virtue ethics has always been there alongside utilitarianism and deontological techniques, methods. It's just that in the 20th century it becomes something that's kind of given a bit more of a name and a kind of thread and a kind of coherency under that term. So it originates in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and brought back into philosophy in large part due to a woman called Gertrude Anscombe, who's an analytical philosopher, 50s in particular, very interesting philosopher. And there's as I mentioned, the book by Alistair McIntyre, a book called After Virtue, tells this really interesting historical story in which he argues that the modern world involves what he calls a conceptual break between ancient and modern frameworks of ethics. So, I mean, in a little bit similar to what I was describing with Nietzsche, and it's actually Alistair McIntyre is very closely reading Nietzsche in this book. But what he argues is that, in a sense, crudely speaking, as capitalism rises, as we move out of more traditional and less universalized and perhaps even less rational kind of systems, it's a bit odd to talk of capitalism as rational, but as we move out of systems that rely upon tradition and religion far more to guide moral worth, and into a kind of secular society, if you like, perhaps think about it like that, a transition we can all kind of orientate is the kind of transition to modernity that we're kind of talking about here, or a break point with modernity. So as we transition through that break point, what happens is that moral theory, moral discussion that existed inside Plato and Aristotle, for example, no longer fits into the common sense framework, and we have a new kind of common sense framework that we then have to reorganize our moral theories into. And one of the things that McIntyre argues is that it might actually be almost impossible to do this, to develop a kind of virtue ethics in a universal way. He talks about small communities and things like this. What is a virtue? So a virtue is a character trait. A character trait is something like a habitual action or emotional response. It's a kind of almost semi-automatic way, or a tendency or a leaning towards behaving in a particular way. And specifically, a virtue is a positive trait that makes its possessor a good human being. So being honest, this is a virtue, perhaps. The development of the virtues, according to Aristotle, involves this thing he calls arete, excellence. So you develop a virtue, you can become more skilled at it, you develop it as a kind of capacity as well. You develop it through practical reasoning, not pure, through a kind of thing he calls phronesis. That's a kind of a knowing how to do something, knowing what's right in the right situation. And you do it, and it's developed, you develop the virtues through an emphasis on what's called eudaimonia. it's another jargon word. Happiness, flourishing is probably better. A kind of general well-being, in a sense. You know, in the way we might talk about, you know, well-being nowadays. Almost, there's almost a kind of eudaimonia, you know, that people are kind of referring to in that sort of situation. It relies, virtue ethics relies on some kind of idea about the function or purpose of the human being, what we're kind of built for, if you like, and human action as well. Because you have the kind of what we're built for, what we're capable of, and whether our actions are adding to that or taking away from that. And if they're adding to that, they can become kind of virtues, and they can expand what we're capable of doing, and they can fulfill our potentials and all these kind of things, or they can take away from that. And so actions are kind of thought of less as in themselves necessarily good and bad, and not really in terms of their consequences, generally speaking, but more in terms of, if you like, their consequences for our character, for our capacity to do good, be good. So it focuses on being, on the kind of beings that we are, rather than explicitly focusing on acts and behaviours. And so, generally speaking, virtue ethics talks about moral character, how to cultivate it, how to improve it, what it is. And it will talk about moral character rather than moral actions, you know, whether that action is right or wrong, what to do in that particular situation, and how to calculate it, work it out. But of course, as the theme of tonight is saying, you know, problems with virtue ethics. I mean, you know, you can see the pattern here. It's not difficult, and that's partly because we're just doing a first overview. Really, you'd obviously look in each of these things in a lot more detail. We're not really going into the arguments here. We're just giving you some sort of feel of the landscape. Problems with virtue ethics are to do with relativism. That's one of the big ones. In, you know, there are different situations, different societies, different cultures going to have different virtues, and they're also going to have different concepts of what a human being is, its functions, its purposes. So, you know, we can think of here, as I've put up there, sort of differences in different cultures between things like individual autonomy versus collective responsibility. I mean, there's a huge issue of cultural relativism here, which is an issue for those people who don't like relativism. But generally speaking, the argument will be something like, you know, if it's going to be a moral judgment, then generally speaking, there should be, it seems, a way in which it can be, you know, applicable. And there may be variations, but you're not going to have the same thing in two diametrically opposed, you know, really clearly opposed kind of evaluations in different cultures. You know, the idea would be that there is a kind of consistency, even if only in the fact that we are able to talk about right and wrong moral actions across cultural boundaries. So there is some sort of consistency that should be looked for within moral theories, moral moral valuations, and so anything that sort of drops us back into a relativism is denying that capacity. And so, you know, if that's an issue, maybe we don't know. But it's definitely something worth, you know, it's definitely not something to be ignored. There's also the question of how distinct it really is from deontology or utilitarianism, because in those theories, there's also quite clearly the promotion of virtues, and there's characters that can be developed in positive or negative ways. If that's all virtue ethics has, this reliance on character, then to a certain extent it might be said to be kind of, you know, weaker in a way than utilitarianism or deontology, because that emphasis is also there, that focus is also there, but they've also got this kind of, you know, tools for dealing with the specific acts, not just the sort of general characters. And there's a vagueness, people will say, to the idea of practical wisdom, practical knowledge, phronesis, this knowing how to do the right thing in the right place kind of situation. Because one of the issues with phronesis is you can't teach it through rules, you can't teach it through reason, you can only teach it through experience. which might seem obvious to some of us, but that has a kind of difficulty when it comes to moral theory, because you're gonna essentially you're gonna learn how to do right by doing wrong. That's the problem with learning through experiences. You're gonna make errors, you're gonna make mistakes, and then when it comes to morality, what that means is you're going to do something that's bad, in order before you had to do something that's good. Anyway, so those three. The reason for giving this sort of brief overview is to kind of just to make sure because we all need to be, roughly speaking, at least the same kind of territory. So that's the general idea. And also it gives you a link. If you want to go and connect and look at one of these in a bit more detail, there's 3 options there for you to go and look at. But I want to talk a little bit for this last 15 minutes, a bit more loosely, a bit more generally, but starting from a problem that arises with the Greeks, with Socrates, and in some sense arises, it's kind of the background to some of Aristotle's work in the Nicomachean Ethics and other places, in which he's kind of arguing against Socrates, in a sense, trying to develop what Socrates, sort of a problem he has. And this problem is a kind of general one, and we can call it, again, these are lots of jargony words here, acrasia. Acrasia means weakness of the will, roughly speaking. Weakness of the will. And so we can phrase it in these kind of terms. If you know what the right thing to do is, then why do you still do the wrong thing? If you know what the right thing to do is, why do you still do the wrong thing? So, I mean, and the answer is weakness of the will. The answer is because your will isn't strong enough to carry out what your reason is telling you is the right thing to do. I mean, that's how this problem kind of develops. Obviously, it develops from the fact that people continue to do shitty stuff to each other. They continue to lie and cheat and be morally negative, let's say, even when in conversation they can be fully persuaded, and they can know themselves that that's the wrong thing to do. So the problem is knowledge of the good enough to produce the good. Okay, so a virtue ethics response with phronesis, practical wisdom. Prudence is a nice way of thinking about phronesis, but it's a very old and archaic word in English now, prudence, how to be prudent. Obviously, what virtue ethics is saying is that kind of process is that process of encountering your failures, encountering acrasia, knowing what is the right thing to do and then still not being able to do it. What you're encountering there is the role of the character. And so you know that you need to develop the capacities you have in order to be able to, be virtuous. And so there's a kind of, answer that can be offered by virtue ethics quite strongly in terms of character, in which that kind of failure, moral failing, isn't so much an error as an experience. And I think that's one of the difficulties when we think about acrasia, because it's what we're kind of thinking about is something to do with why behaviours don't change as much as we might think they should, why moral questions still come up, how difficult is it to teach people some basic morality. You might think, we all could be taught some, simple rules of life, and yet this doesn't seem to be the case. And it becomes more complicated when we begin to connect morality to politics and society, and I think hopefully we'll talk a little bit about this in the seminar. But one of the ways to think about this is so Spinoza, one of the rationalists I mentioned before, in a text called the Theologico Political Treatise, asks the question, why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? And this is more than just acrasia. This is almost what we might almost call something like a self-destructive tendency, or a kind of inadvertent consequences, or that there is some other kind of dynamic going on here, that this problem of failing to do the right thing is encountering possibly more than one problem. And so acrasia is also connected to issues that arise around questions of desire. And in particular, when I use the word desire, the thing that should flash in your mind is Freud. That's essentially Freud, the unconscious libidinal desires. These are kind of, core problematics that are introduced in the late sort of 19th century. And when that kind of Freudian element of the unconscious and desire is added in, again, we've got another kind of complication to why do people behave badly, and I mean, there was a Freudian Marxist psychoanalyst, it's a good combination, I think, called Wilhelm Reich, and he wrote in response to the rise of fascism in Germany in a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, that the astonishing thing is not that some people steal or that others occasionally go out on strike, but rather that all those who are starving do not steal as a regular practice, and all those who are exploited are not continually out on strike. After centuries of exploitation, why do people still tolerate being humiliated and enslaved to such a point, indeed, that they actually want humiliation and slavery not only for others but for themselves? Now that actually want it, that's the controversial bit in Reich there, and to a certain extent a similar thing comes up in much more contemporary philosophy in Deleuze and Guattari in their Anti-Oedipus text, where they say, in the subject who desires, desire can be made to desire its own repression. And so this element that originates in Freud and then gets transmuted and looked at by Reich in fascism, and then is sort of articulated in terms of a subject who can desire in Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. This is more than just a kind of unintended consequences or self-destructive behaviour. This is a kind of a suggestion that something about pleasure, going all the way back to the utilitarians, something about pleasure exists or can be produced in the negative morality, in a kind of negative activity, in a we might call something, we're familiar with things like what people call Schadenfreude, and sometimes people might refer to this as negative solidarity, where you kind of you see someone, you're both workers perhaps even in the same factory, and you see someone else getting a little bit of a fucking break, and you kind of are pissed off with them rather than the fact that you're both being shat upon by someone else, or the government. People, when they do this with people getting benefits, it's like, well, I'm pissed off with them because I've got to work a 55-hour crappy job for shitty money, rather than being pissed off with the boss is making them work the 55-hour crappy job with shitty money, because there's this kind of connection of choice and character and all sorts of strange dynamics of propaganda and ideology and things that we take to be good and bad. There's a whole range of social interactions there that kind of overwrite our moral questions. And I was watching that demonstration before. The demonstration was in London before the lecture started this evening, just to sort of see what was going on, because so it's live streamed on YouTube. And one of the things that was interesting, and I didn't show the chat on stream. It was a live stream on YouTube, and the chat was just this stream of attack, a stream of, it wasn't even attack, it was this stream of like expressing disgust, expressing, and you're thinking, I'm thinking, it seems a perfectly quiet, reasonable demonstration where they were putting up posters and banners and placards and trying to get people to take pictures and trying to sort of just, put a particular bit of noise, a chant, a phrase, a slogan, an image into the general space of conversation after something really fucking shitty's happened. And for some reason this really winds people up. And I think there's an element of moral theory that that becomes interesting again once it begins to talk about the way in which moral behaviour is always social behaviour. And I think both Nietzsche and Deleuze and Guattari do this to a certain extent, as do people like Reich, as do people like Freud. And so I think there is a kind of moral theory that's buried away outside of utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics. There's a kind of moral theory that's buried away in thinkers that try and deal with the complexity of what it is to be a human animal. And I think that that's a kind of another way of dealing with moral theories. And there is a kind of there is a problem of a craze. There is a problem of weakness of the will for all of the theories I've talked to you about, and a problem between knowing, having the knowledge and using the knowledge. Having the knowledge that this is the wrong thing to do, and then using that knowledge to make sure you don't do the wrong thing. But behind that, there are the very impulses, desires, libidinal, moments, and all of the things that are almost at a level of the social or the species, or our genetics, perhaps, all kind of different levels that are also driving, that are actually only dealt with in terms of moral theory in work. I think that has the word desire in it, because in a sense there it's not about how you can make moral judgments, it's about why it is humans behave badly when they do and how they do, and so it's a kind of slightly different shift in the problem. So I suppose when you come to morality, the question you have to ask yourself is, are you a moral cynic? Do you think there's no possible solution to moral questions? Well, if so, I invite you to, at the very minimum, explore the three theories that offer positive possibilities and positive ways of dealing with your moral cynicism. There are very sensible, serious, well thought out answers with a lot of complexity there, and that deal with a lot of difficult issues, and in which you can find a lot of resources. If, however, you're not a moral cynic in the sense in which you don't think there's any possible moral answers, but you're kind of morally confused by the different answers that you might want to get, then you might want to shift your focus slightly and think about, the way in which desire theories, let's call them that, from Spinoza onwards, have tried to articulate something like a social morality or a social background to morality around the notion of the human animal and the human animal's behaviours. And so you can go in that particular direction as well, which I've only just sort of sketched it out a little bit for you, but there is also that option if you're particularly interested. The advantage of all moral theory, and this is an advantage in many ways, is that it's far more practical. It's far more practically focused than metaphysics or epistemology, and it's far less abstract than logic. And so if you are interested in your philosophy because you're interested in how to live a better life, then actually you should explore moral theory. It's going to be useful here because it's going to train you, even if you can't find the answers directly out of some of the moral theories, it's going to train you in attentive argument that pays, that gives weight and value to concrete examples. And before I go, I'm going to mention one final thing. In fact, I might even play this. No, I won't play it because it's too much of a meme. So one final thing, and we can mention this inside River if you like, or in the seminar, or you can chat to me on Discord as I say about it. So the trolley problem. There are a whole bunch of things on the internet about the trolley problem. This is a thought experiment that is, that explores an inconsistency in our moral intuitions. And the inconsistency is that, faced with a train track in which there's 5 people going to die on one side and 1 on the other, and there's a kind of points where we can switch the train from one point to the other, so it's going to kill 1 person or it's going to kill 5. We feel like it's okay to switch it to the 5. It's not something we want to do, but feel like it's okay to switch it to the 5. But if we're in a hospital and there are 4 people dying of organ failures, and someone comes in who's relatively healthy but they've got organs that we could harvest to save the other 4 people, we think there's something wrong there. Actually, I'm pretty sure there's something wrong there in harvesting organs to save the other 4. Even though the calculus is the same, 4 versus 1, 5 versus 1, whatever. So the calculus, comes out the same, but there's an inconsistency. Our moral intuitions tell us sort of respond differently to those two situations. And it's become a bit of a meme, the trolley problem, and a bit of a disaster for philosophy in many ways. So I'm mentioning it just to get it out of the way, but I'm not going to deal with it in any more detail. As I say, you're welcome to talk about it in Discord or River or on seminars or whatever. Anyway, that's it for this evening. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about Nietzsche and truth and lies in an extra moral sense. And I'm going to go and start the seminar now for people in River, from people from Free University Brighton. Everyone else, see you later, and thanks for being here.